All right. Well, hello. Glad you're all here. We're going to pick up where we left off and double back just a little bit to make sure that we're all on the same page. So, this is our second to last of our sessions, I believe. Let me, 3, 4, 5. There's 4 for this side of the table. I think we're not going to the 22nd. I think we're going to go to 15th. That's all right? Oh, okay. So there's some there, and there's... I miscounted. Did we already hand this out once? Oh, okay. Maybe. Not today. Is that the same page? Oh, maybe it's the same page. Okay. So I want to make... Maybe you do have this. I wanted to just make sure that we know where we are, and then I have another handout for us. 2 more. All right, so just to review. We're talking, of course, we're going back to the sources, so we're looking at Jewish sacred literature, and so we go back to the Tanakh, or the Jewish Bible, or the Old Testament. They all refer to the same body of literature, the same canon of material, which is at the top of this handout. It's referred to here as the written Torah. The written Torah is is sort of inside baseball for Jews. Most of you may not even be aware of the written Torah, oral Torah, but in terms of the sacred revealed literature that is the Bible, it's considered the written Torah, the conceit being that where the written Torah, or the Torah as we have it, remember the Torah is a metonym, a part that represents the whole, for all of Revelation. The conceit is that we don't know how to interpret Revelation. We don't know what it actually means to be fruitful and multiply, or to not kill, or to honor the Sabbath, or to not boil a kid in its mother's milk, or to observe the Sabbath day. We don't know what that means absent an interpretive tradition, or the authority to make meaning of these texts. And the Jewish conceit is the myth that atop Mount Sinai, in addition to what Moses received by way of the Ten Commandments, he also receives an oral tradition, or an oral tradition accompanies the written tradition. We have someone's phone going off, so that's someone's bag over there? Okay, well then it'll go off soon enough. Okay. The oral Torah is made up of material that is both halachic, we're going to talk about that, which is legal material, and agadic, which is non-legal material, sort of fiction or non-fiction and fiction, sort of backwards, right? Legal material and non-legal material. And the 2 big compendia of these collections are Talmud and Midrash. And we'll talk more about that. So in the bottom half of this page, we have the oral Torah, which starts with the Talmudic works, and then you see Midrash on the bottom right as well. It probably actually began as more Midrash, interpretive material, that then got separated out into that which was legal, which became Talmudic, and that which was not legal, which continued to be known as Midrash. All right. Let me hand out this handout. We're going to just define 2 significant terms. It's double-sided. We're going to start with Torah. Enough go around there? All right, is there extras? I'll take them if there are. Okay, we're going to look at Torah first. Remember, Torah has a definitive definition, that's a bad phrase, has a certain definition, which is to say it refers to the double scrolls on which are written the 5 first books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And largely the Torah, those first 5 books of the Jewish Bible or of the Old Testament, comprise our lectionary, largely. We don't think of it as a lectionary, we think of it as the Torah portion of the week, but the entire Torah is divided into weekly readings, and they're assigned such that each week sequentially you'll make your way through the reading of these first 5 books. And Torah refers to the larger body of Jewish learning, Jewish thought, that which is derived from the original revelation, is sometimes also referred to as Torah. So when Jonathan asked on Sunday morning a couple of days ago, just a reference, what is a rabbi? A rabbi means teacher. What is a rabbi a teacher of? My answer was Torah. But it's not only those first 5 books. Okay, all right, so let's take a look at this definition. The idea of one God is shared by other religious traditions. So too is the general notion of divine revelation. Unique to Judaism, however, is the concept of Torah. Originally, Torah was taken to mean the written law, the Tanakh, which is more than the Torah. Remember, just so that we're clear here. Torah is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which is what we have in this scroll, right? And if we were to open this up, this scroll, we'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right to left, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Right? We know that the Tanakh is, the Jewish Bible is Torah, plus the prophets, in Hebrew it's called Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, which is the writings. And if you look at that first handout I gave you, or the repetitive one, you'll see what those include. And so we're using the word Torah to refer to this as well as all of that. Okay. Originally, Torah was taken to mean the written law, the Tanakh alone. Rabbinic Judaism expanded the concept of Torah. Rabbinic Judaism is the 1st through 2nd centuries, contemporaneous. The rabbis, when I speak of the rabbis, I'm speaking of them with a capital R. You may know them in the Christian literature as the Pharisees. They were the elite sages of the day. Right? They were the power brokers. They were the one who, in following the destruction of the temple, when sacrifices could no longer be offered, that was in the year 70, so that's another 30-some years after Jesus' crucifixion, right? They can no longer offer sacrifices, so how do the Jews then go on continuing to communicate with God in the absence of being able to offer these sacrifices? And the answer is through prayer and study, and then what becomes the rabbinic tradition. But the rabbis are working with a tradition that had been extant but oral up to that point. So I'm reading a book a friend recommended to me in light of the parables class we're teaching. That's called They Taught in Parables 2, T-O-O. They taught in Parables 2 about the rabbis and of that 1st and 2nd century, the way in which they used these kind of parables or stories. So there was a contemporaneous idiom, right? It's not that they informed one another, but they were working with the same kind of material. That's the period in which we're talking. So rabbinic Judaism, the rabbis, the contemporaries of Jesus and the disciples, expanded the concept of Torah to include the so-called oral law. So let's just appreciate what they're doing is providing a formalized means of educing that which the Torah describes. Jesus is doing something not so very dissimilar, which is to say, re-understanding or re-prioritizing or re-revealing in some ways what the text really means, what you should focus on. So where the rabbis, which is, see if I can do this. The laws of keeping kosher are derived from the book of Leviticus, in which not only are certain foods, certain animals proscribed, don't eat swine, don't eat certain fish, don't eat certain foods, right? But they're also describing, and then the rabbinic tradition explaining, how you go about fulfilling these laws, separating milk and meat, and then how many hours between them. And what happens if a milk spoon gets in contact with a meat dish, and how do you solve for that? All that law is derived from the rabbinic tradition. But Jesus was suggesting something similar in regards to understanding how we make sense of these laws by saying essentially, tell me, you give me the better quote, it's not what you put into your mouth, but what comes out of your mouth, right? That's sort of saying, don't trouble yourselves in some ways, we could argue. Don't trouble yourselves with the minutia of the dietary laws. Be concerned with how you speak and treat each other. Okay, we can argue about whether that's a legitimate interpretation, but he's doing the same activity as are the rabbis, which is to saying, how do we make these real in our lives today? That speaks then, just begins to hint at the natural tension that would be between this internecine Jewish discussion. There's a new book on Jewish messianism, or messianism in Judaism. And I've been asked to review it for the Jewish Chronicle, and the story is, or the new scholarship is, that whereas often in the Gospels, the Jews are described as being opposed to that which Jesus was presenting, a more nuanced, sensitive reading of that history seems to reveal that within the Jewish community, before Jesus shows up, within the Jewish community, there are ongoing debates about messianism. Will a Messiah be this characteristic, or have these characteristics, or come from within the community, or how will we know? Do we believe in a Messiah? Are we waiting for a Messiah? These are disputes going on much like, I don't know, I don't get into trouble here, but within a political party. They're grappling with what the party will stand for. We have a platform, but today it seems that demographically we need something different, or we have new economic realities, or new understandings, or new needs, and so we're going to grapple with what the platform of the party is going to be. Not dissimilarly, in these centuries, the Jews were debating these same kinds of things. Jesus comes along from within the Jewish community as a particular point of view. It's not that it was diametrically opposed to the entire Jewish community, or that the entire Jewish community was lined up opposite Jesus. It was an internal struggle. And I'm trying to point out to you that as the rabbis were engaged in their oral Torah activities, so too were other communities within the larger Jewish polity. Okay.
How did the Pharisees look at John the Baptist?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that they describe or take up John the Baptist. The rabbis don't take up Jesus per se, right? They're not taking that on directly, which either may mean that in that generation it wasn't as significant an event as we might like to read back into it. You know, we have what's called, human beings who read history, have there's a fallacy that we fall into, which is called the great man theory of history, which is that we imagine that anyone who's accomplished anything in history was always recognized as having those qualities, such that little George Washington was always scrupulously honest, and little Abe Lincoln was always a peacemaker between people who didn't, I mean, that kind of idea, right? Or that whoever it is, it's not clear that in the moment, in the years that Jesus was growing up, or that was practicing the ministry, that it turned the Jewish community on its head such that they would respond to that. In point of fact, maybe this is dangerous to say, but I was in a class years ago at Penn in leadership, and the professor invited everyone to volunteer leaders that come to mind, leaders of anything, because the goal was going to be to see if we couldn't find the X factor that every leader possessed, such that we could draw a plumb line and say, well, if you have this characteristic, you're going to be or we could say every leader has this characteristic. Turns out there isn't such an X factor, one quality that will make for a good leader, which is why leaders come in all kinds of different ways. But as we were engaging in this, people said Winston Churchill, Abraham Lincoln, naming various presidents or corporate titans or military leaders, and someone said, Jesus. Okay, puts the person on the board, but then turns to me and says, Rabbi, what do you think of that? And I said, well, I think Jesus deserves to be on the board, but let me vote for Paul, right? Because if you're really talking about who led the charge of setting this message out, arguably Paul was part of it. Okay, so in the first century, in these early years of the Common Era, these conversations were going on about how do we make sense of this text? And given all the oral traditions and the increasing complexity of the world, it becomes important to begin writing these things down. And that really becomes the innovation, as it were, or the new piece of this, that when we start writing things down, well, things both become more clear and defined, and we now don't have as much wiggle room, right? And so now we may have things in opposition because you've staked out your position. Or this is what you said, I'm going to keep you to your word. Yeah.
Did the writing down begin only after the temple?
Well, so we date, it's a good question. We date the first collection of Midrashim as a collected body, and the first chronicling of what becomes the Mishnah, which is the earliest part of what we know as the Talmud, to the 1st and 2nd centuries. And we consider the Mishnah complete by the year 200 or so, and the Talmud by 500, and so there were centuries of this activity, but yes.
What about Babylon?
So in Babylonia, or by the waters of Babylon, where they wept, right, for the return to Zion, there is an activity going on simultaneously in these years, and so we have what's called the Babylonian Talmud, as well as the Jerusalem Talmud. And they're very similar, but they're not exactly similar, because in these two different communities, the material is being collected similarly, but not exactly, and there are different mores and insights we can glean from comparing different texts. But this activity was happening concurrently. Okay? All right. So let's keep reading about Torah. Even though the Talmud was acknowledged to have been written by later sages, they were said to have acted under a prophetic inspiration that stemmed from the original revelation to Moses at Mount Sinai. According to the Talmud, that is to say, the rabbis are explaining how it is that they themselves, it's a tautology, right? Once you're in the system, it makes sense. But the rabbis are claiming, the analogy I used last time was the same way the Supreme Court claimed for itself the right to interpret the Constitution, not granted them in the Constitution, so too the rabbis claim for themselves in the Talmud the right to write the Talmud. Fine? Okay. According to the Talmud, prophecy and the authority to establish new laws ceased as the Talmud was being completed. Well, that's convenient, right? The editors determined that, and this is the final edition, friends. Not only do we decide that we have the right to write this, and it's authoritative, because we said so, but having completed our work, no one else can engage in this work, right? In other words, the sages put self-closure on the process of revelation by contending that they were the last generations to receive the dictates of the divine will, and also prophecies done. By the way, if someone comes to you and says that God spoke to them and they're a prophet, prophecy's over. That doesn't, right? And they sort of cut off all the exit ramps, right, to make it not so possible, which is why Jesus is a threat, right? He's gone rogue, essentially, right? I'm a part of a discussion group that is in town called the Junta, Junta, and it's based on a salon that Ben Franklin created way back when. It's been this group's been in existence over 100 years, and I've been in this group about a dozen years. It meets monthly. And every session that we have, there's a topic assigned, and two of the members present a paper on the topic, and then everyone responds to the paper, and that's the evening. Okay. So the topics vary every time we meet, and there's a program committee that puts it out for the year, and the topic for last evening was public mandates and individual freedoms, which everyone was very worried about because we were sure that we were going to have to spend an evening debating about masks and vaccines and the government telling you what you should do and you deciding that, it's my body, my choice. In point of fact, the two papers couldn't have been further from this, but they both spoke to individuals or movements that bucked convention. So the first paper was about ukulele playing and how the standard playing of the ukulele changed in the 20th century because of some new practitioners who emphasized playing in a different way, and as a result, we now have the claw hammer type of picking, or we now have this type of picking. And the gentleman who presented this played the ukulele in the course of his presentation and gave us an insight into different ways of playing the ukulele. His point being that in any artistic endeavor, at a certain point, someone comes along and says, Picasso, we're going to deal with cubism, or we're going to put something, turn it on its head. And in point of fact, when I preached last time, a couple weeks ago here, and I spoke about Rembrandt, and what Rembrandt did in this book was for the first time in the 17th century, was depict Jesus based on his Jewish neighbors. So he looked darker, he looked Semitic, he looked more humane in the way a real person looks, as opposed to painting another idealized version of God the Messiah, or God incarnate, that idea, based on centuries of artistic convention. In the 17th century, Rembrandt breaks with that convention. In the paper, this ukulele player, the other paper was about Admiral Hyman Rickover, right? Founded, built the atomic naval fleet, and he was a Jewish immigrant kid when he came along, and the story was about, as an immigrant, what an outsider he was initially. He was 6 years old when he arrived in New York with his parents, speaking Yiddish, Polish, and a bit of Russian. He obviously masters the public school system, makes his way to the Naval Academy. At the end of the Naval Academy, gets the top billing, and pretty soon he's on his way to being Admiral Rickover. But when he brought the idea to the Navy after World War II that we should invest in nuclear power to power submarines and Air Force carriers, and the rest, that was a huge redoing of the Navy, met all kinds of opposition. I mentioned both these stories to you because every once in a while someone comes along who is the iconoclast who says, for all the convention up till now, the way we've seen the world, the way we've organized our systems, the way in which we understood government or religion or whatever, along comes somebody new, often from the inside. That's where they're usually most successful, which is why we emphasize that Jesus was a Jew, right? And presents a new way of doing that. But it's a threat to the status quo. It's a threat to the hegemony of the elites of the day who are vested in this. And whenever I hear these kinds of stories, years ago, not so many years ago, 5 years ago maybe, I did a funeral for a physician in town, academic medicine, who had gone against the entire medical establishment to redefine how we do. It was actually about prophylactic mastectomies for breast cancer. And we didn't need to do it that way. We could save people all this trauma and all this terrible stuff. But it flew in the face of decades of scientific literature and investment in careers. Okay, so the rabbis were doing something similar, and Jesus was as well. Although the movements of modern Judaism, end of the second paragraph, although the movements of modern Judaism differ on what constitutes Torah, and that we'll say something about, how it was created and the extent of its authority, all agree that it is the foundation of Judaism. Both the Torah, written, and the oral Torah, the traditions, without which we're no longer able to make sense of the Torah. All of our conceptions about how to do Judaism are based on a rabbinic worldview or rabbinic lens. All right? We can say more about that. Should we say more about that? Is there questions about that so far? Okay, we can double back if we need to. It will become apparent that the debate among the movements of Judaism, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, the debates among the movements of Judaism is whether the Torah is the directly revealed Word of God or the indirectly revealed, humanly written, divinely inspired Word of God. Not to be overlooked, however, is the fact that Torah, however defined and understood, remains a kind of blueprint for the observance of Judaism. Some may adopt the blueprint as it was once drawn, others may modify specifications, but the basic plan remains in use. So in shorthand, know something about, we haven't really spent much time on it, about the movements within Judaism. In broad strokes, the movements in Judaism are usually understood the Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. There's also what we call Reconstructionist. There are many others. We could do humanist, we could do right, we could, within categories within this, ultra-Orthodox, all kinds of different things. For our purposes, the Orthodox believe the Torah was divinely revealed. That the Torah is authoritative because God said it. Conservative tends to take the position that it's a product, the Torah is, that evolved and developed over time. It's a product of the rabbinic processes, and those processes continue for the conservative movement by abrogating for a small group of conservative rabbis the authority to rule on decisions with regard to how to follow the Torah today that will be incumbent upon or required of the community. But it's abrogated to a small group of rabbis, and it's called the Committee of Laws and Standards. So it's still in the rabbinic purview, even as conservative Jews may or may not choose to observe it. Thank you. In the Reform world, the more liberal of the Jewish movements, we don't accept that the Torah was divinely revealed on Mount Sinai as described in the Torah. We accept that it's been evolved and interpreted as a process of rabbinic understanding. But today, each of us as an autonomous individual can make his or her own decisions. We hope they're informed, we hope they're well educated, they're guided by rabbinic opinions and advice and guidance. But ultimately, the Reform position is that insofar as every individual is an autonomous self, the tradition itself doesn't overrule that which your own conscience dictates or your own intellectual lodestar points in the right direction. Just for our purposes, Reconstructionist Judaism is a much more democratic process, and the decisions tend to be made, at least philosophically, in a communal way. So if Orthodox says that the tradition is as we received it from our grandparents, and it's immutable, which essentially is the position, and they received it from their grandparents, right, all the way back. And if conservative says we've inherited this tradition, it's divinely inspired, if not revealed, but we're going to leave to a group of rabbis today, contemporary rabbis, who understand our world, but are schooled in this methodology, and they'll make the decisions on our behalf. That's actually true. The Orthodox is true, but they just don't make any real changes. Reform says it's not divinely revealed. If you want to call it divinely inspired, that's fine. We could have the conversation about whether the Bible is somehow more inspired or differently inspired than was any other work of great literature or Shakespeare or love poetry or the next poem you come up with as you sit alone and stare at the night sky, and, right? I mean, is that not also divinely inspired? It doesn't much matter for our purposes. It's poetry. The upshot is that you get to make your own decisions, which idiomatically is referred to in the Jewish community as everyone making their own Shabbat. The idea that if everyone can decide, well, I don't need, it's not, remember we said that the Jewish days begin in the evening because the rabbis interpreted that Genesis begins or concludes each of the first 6 days, it was evening and morning. That's a rabbinic interpretation that says, well, so let's start our days in the evening. And then they go, well, when's evening? They say, well, when 3 stars are out, right? And they say, well, when's morning? When's daybreak? When do you say your morning prayers? What time do you say your morning prayers? And when's it too late? You've missed the morning. I mean, that's a fair enough question, right? And so they determine that when there's enough light for you to see your friends or your neighbor's face, well, that's a fascinating way of understanding when the day begins or what you're responsible to, right? If you're telling time based on how well you can see other people, well, that's a whole other social dynamic and construction in this, right? If everyone's making their own Shabbat, however, it starts whenever you want, you do whatever you want, right? Our strengths are our weaknesses, and so, right? And so insofar as we do it by our own lights, that may feel very empowering. But it frays at community, right? That is the tension within communities. How much autonomy versus how much community? I often have opportunities to distill down complex conversations, not unlike the one I invited you to appreciate from last evening about mandates and freedoms, right? Whether it's the government telling us that we have to mask, or the kids have to stay out of school, or you got to, whatever it may be, right? Or whether it's, remember early in the pandemic, when we learned about PPE, the personal protective equipment, and some hospitals had them and some didn't, and the question was, what responsibility does any given hospital have to share this PPE that they have with others, or does it make more sense to husband it until they need it themselves? And so I describe these complex riddles, as it were, public policy riddles, and personal conscience riddles, as a tension between me versus we. That shows up in a dyad. Think of any dyad you've ever been in. You've got to figure out me versus we to make that work. Within a family, around the dinner table, in a congregation, in a country. The questions are about me versus we. How much am I going to share? How many more tax, decimal points am I willing to pay to the larger polity versus how much am I entitled to? I worked hard for this. This is mine. right? How much accommodation are we give? Some of the questions about, I think, about being in person we were talking about versus being on Zoom, some of it may be dictated by the bus is too much of a hassle and the Zoom is so convenient. Okay. But some of it is also about how much we want to actually be inconvenienced by being in the room with other people, where someone's phone goes off and we can't control it, or someone's hearing aid is at a high pitch, or someone's elbows are too pointed and too close to us, or whatever else it is. How much do we want to allow for being with others? Is a real value in that, right? The silver lining of Zoom was wonderful for the pandemic now versus 100 years ago, but it also gave rise to what Peggy Noonan, the speechwriter for George W. Bush, most famous for 1,000 Points of Light. She wrote an editorial probably about 2 years ago now, concerned that New York City wasn't going to come back after the pandemic because people were no longer driving in for work or going in for dinner and a show, and so it just didn't have the energy that it used to have. And she described in this wonderful felicitous turn of phrase with regard to pandemic behaviors, is that a human habit has been broken. I thought, what a great way of describing it. There's no judgment, there's no shade. We just do things differently because we unlearned patterns, or we got familiar with new things, or we think twice about actually driving into church or downtown or wherever it may be. A human habit has been broken. Okay, so that's what we're grappling with. How much about me versus we? Okay, that's what the Torah. It's the basis of Judaism, and yet depending on what part of Judaism or what community within the Jewish community, larger Jewish community you're part of, will dictate how much, in fact, it's dynamic and how much of it's as it's always been. Let's look on the other side of this page, because I want to draw a contrast for you between the halacha, the legal material, and agada, the non-legal material, or between Talmudic practice or thought and midrashic practice and thought. There's overlap and there's blur between them, but for our purposes I want to make sure they're distinct. So let's look at this piece on halakha. Many Jews agree that allegiance to halakha, more than anything else, has sustained Judaism and the Jewish people. Halakha is the traditional Jewish law contained in the Torah and the Talmud. The word halakha actually comes from the Hebrew root meaning to go or to walk. Halakha is the way, the path that a Jew is commanded to follow. Hebrew language based on 3-letter roots. And so holechet, lalechet, is to walk, to go. Halakha, same root, is the path on which you walk. Okay, so halakha is the word that's used to refer to Jewish law. But more than Jewish law, more nuanced, sort of how to comport yourself. What's expected of you. It may be jurisprudence, and it may be based in law, but there's also a large body of material that expects certain behavior. And not talking back or being sassy isn't illegal, but it's not the way in which we show respect for each other, that kind of thing, right? So halakha is more than just law, it's the path, a way that a Jew is commanded to follow. Halakha was intended to govern all aspects of life. In this, it is what we would consider today civil and religious law, which is why in these conversations about halakha, or often we speak of sharia, about which we don't know very much, you and I, right? The Islamic law, but we appreciate that it's an all-encompassing system, where the interest that you're charged for a loan is as much part of this larger system as is the food you eat, or the time you pray, or how you comport yourself in social relations, and how you engage in business. It's all part of, right? There's no distinction that's made. We don't quite have a concept like that in English law, right? Mostly I think it's because after the Enlightenment, the distinction was made between your private acts or your private understandings, that is to say the religion you practice at home or in church, for instance, versus who you are when you walk in the marketplace or in the public square, right? And following the French Revolution, at least in Western civilization, the French introduced the idea that you could be a Jew or a Christian at home, but in the street, you're a Frenchman. And we have laws that govern how the French people behave. Your religious practice That's a private concern. And that's essentially how it's been in the United States. For us, we treated it largely like that, even though we have unwritten rules about certain things or certain expectations, or religion shows up in our system, then some of us get discomfited by how much religion is there. Just to say this a little bit more about this, I'll give you the American idiom. Speaking of halakha as this encompassing idea, I just had a thought, I just lost it. It had to do with American law to come back to me, I think. I hope it will. I'll let you know.
Yeah.
They say that actually, walking through a doorway helps you jog your, you know that? If you walk into the kitchen, you forget what you went in there for, you should walk out and walk back in, you'll remember. Yes.
Maybe this will write you, but I'm not sure.
Oh.
Are conservative, I might be wrong, but are conservative and Reformed and Reconstructionist Jews only in America? I know they started here, but I know in Israel everyone's really Orthodox.
Yes, it's a great question.
What
So,
about like Europe?
yeah, it's a great question. The Jewish world today can be divided largely into Orthodox and non-Orthodox. Within the non-Orthodox, that's Reform, Conservative, Reconstruction, anything that obviously isn't Orthodox. While Reform Judaism began in Germany in the early 19th century, it's really an American experience or an American product, right? Around the world, non-Orthodox Judaism is sometimes referred to as liberal, progressive, or reform, depending on what part of the world. So the World Union for Progressive Judaism is the international body of reform, progressive, liberal congregations, but different nomenclature. Within my friends who are rabbis in Canada, their Reform Judaism is more akin to our conservative Judaism. It's just more traditional in that regard. I don't know whether that's an American ethos or sort of actions of history in terms of immigration patterns to Canada, which may have been later than for us, or what have you. I just don't know those fault lines. But yes, largely, certainly Reconstructionist Judaism is an American idiom. And so while there are Reform and conservative communities, say, in Israel, they're small. They're growing, but they're small. In Israel, the divide is not between Orthodox and non-Orthodox. Their delineations are between Orthodox and secular, as if there's nothing but Orthodox, which sort of masks the rest. And in many cases, Israelis who are Jewish because they were born Jewish, but they live in a Jewish state, the rhythm, the calendar, all of Jewish, every week there's Shabbat, whether they observe it or not, the buses stop, or restaurants close, or the rest. That in many cases, the synagogue the Israeli does not belong to is the Orthodox synagogue. That is to say, they think of it as the authoritative version of Judaism that in many cases they want nothing to do with. Because they feel it encroaches too much on their lives or makes too many demands or is simply not modern. But the idiom of Reform or progressive or liberal Judaism is foreign to them. It's an import, effectively. Like so much of liberalism. I mean, it comes to the Middle East, that's a very Western concept. And we may think, whoa, that's synonymous with modernity, and you're in the Middle Ages. Well, says you, American, right? That makes sense? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so maybe we'll come back to it. Halakha. Halakha was intended to govern civil and religious law. The body of regulations that comprise halakha deal with everything from agriculture and business to prayer and charity. In previous eras, rabbis and leaders of the Jewish community were charged with enforcing halakha throughout the community. The question of halakha's authority is naturally linked to one's view of Torah and is thus very much a subject of debate within the Jewish community. So never mind whether you believe whether the Torah is itself authoritative because God wrote it, but the commentaries that are on it, on which this body of law has been derived, itself, for some, is questioned or not authoritative. That's in for Reformed Jews, right? We don't accept Reformed Jews that this was all given, dictated, infallibly, immutably, exactly as was on the day one that we now have, and therefore it's binding on us. Reform Jews, Conservative Jews, Reconstruction Jews tend to play in the space that says the degree to which it's binding is actually, it's either intellectually or morally persuasive, or we recognize that it has a claim on us because of the significance or the import or the centrality that it's held within the community. Does that make sense? So you could be a fly on the wall of a Jewish home in which you would see them keeping kosher or avoiding certain foods. Certain foods don't come into the house or what have you because they're Jewish and that's just not what they do. But it's not because they believe that God said don't eat pork or because the rabbis determined that this or the other is permissible and isn't. It tends to be more because this is how we do it. This is what's become important to us, which isn't simply just a preference, I want to suggest. The significance or the centrality for us, modern religious folks, or religiously interested folks, what claim does the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, what claim does a religious text have on us? Well, ultimately, I would suggest that we, with free will, choose to step into a space that says we're going to privilege or prioritize these teachings or these lessons, either because we think that God gave it to us and this is definitive, or because they've served us really well and they're a good way to build a family around, or they're a good way to build a community around, or if you turns out if you follow these wisdom teachings or these parables, you know what, your life is more meaningful, and not only that, and then things follow. So it doesn't matter exactly how you get into it, right, or whether you accept it as true or not, but it's the importance that you ascribe to it. Goes to liberal thinking. Right? Are there questions about that? Okay. The question of Halacha's authority is naturally linked to one's view. Two of Judaism's four major movements accept the binding nature of Halakha, and two do not. But the questions concerning Halakha are not limited to authority. They extend to who should determine what Halakha says and how. On these issues, the movements disagree not only with each other, but within themselves. When considering the issues of halakha from a comparative denominational perspective, three questions are crucial. Is halakha binding upon the people? Can it be changed if necessary? And who should interpret it? Okay. Now, I want to share this next piece. This is really a beautiful piece. That's enough. This is from a book called Song to Creation, which was written by a professor of mine, late Eugene Mahali, who imagines, do we have some extras? I'll take it extra. Thank you. Who imagines what it is that was going on in the earliest academy of rabbis as they began to engage in this activity. So he's going to invite us to sort of imagine that we're the rabbis sitting around the table. The text is in front of us. We're going to start with the very beginning of Genesis, and we're going to decide, we've decided that we're going to plumb this text for meaning, or we're going to figure out what it says, or what we can derive from it by way of an understanding of the world and a way of understanding what's expected of us and what it means to be a Jew or a human being in the world. All right? Let me walk you through this. So this is the text. In the beginning, God created. In the Hebrew, it's Bereshit bara Elohim. Implicit in the midrashic exposition of a biblical text are a number of assumptions accepted without question by a second or third century audience, the context of the discourse, the thought patterns, canons of logic, literary forms, the psychology and the picture of reality current in the early centuries of the Christian era. That is to say, in the same way as you and I pick up the newspaper, and we understand as we open the pages of the newspaper that we're in the third decade of the 21st century. We have a system of government that's established in this pattern. The globe is arranged in this way such that a threat from North Korea or the activity in Ukraine, it's not an immediate threat to our own safety, and yet we know something about the world around us, and it need not be discussed. Think of the news from yesterday about the Georgia runoff. We all understand elections. We understand that of the 50 states, each of them, because of federalism, controls their elections in a little bit different ways. Georgia has a particular means by which of doing a runoff when the earlier election is too close. We know something about the composition of the Senate, right? We bring these. The newspaper article may give you some of that, but it's not really required for you to appreciate that it's a loss for this group and a win for that group, and it has implications, right? And the same thing is true that for the 2nd and 3rd century audiences that would have been engaged in this, the 2nd and 3rd century being, we're now post-Mishnah, right, the earliest Talmudic material, and we're now discussing what those earliest interpretations mean, right? Remember, we're sort of building the husk around the kernel, all right? All right. So all these thought patterns, canons of logic, literary forms, the picture of the current reality, none of them need to be discussed, just as we today communicate within a tacitly assumed context. When we use the word earth, for example, we do not feel it necessary to explain that we have in mind a sphere which revolves around the sun. So with the literary creativity of each age, implicit in a text is its context, which must be made explicit if we are to recover the intent of the author or the meaning of a literary composition, which is why we're talking about what's happening concurrently in this part of the Jewish community and that part of the Jewish community, and what happened in the year 33 and what happened in the year 70, so that we appreciate what the significance of the end of this first century meant, right? Okay. Man is most often unaware of significant aspects of his environment. We accept them unconsciously. We live them, just as we are normally oblivious to our heartbeat or the air we breathe, the incessant cacophony of all that is about us that we call silence. So are we largely unaware of the myths, the science, the cultural tools of our surroundings, implicit in every word we utter. Only when the environment changes, when the heartbeat accelerates or falters, or perhaps during moments of heightened sensitivity, when we view ourselves and our world about us from the perspective of the poet or the artist, does the hidden become revealed and conscious. Think about when you become keenly aware of your own circumstance or environment. I'll give you some examples where this probably has happened to you, and classically. Remember early when you were a child and you went to have dinner at somebody else, at a friend's house, and they did their dinner table differently. I don't know, we weren't allowed to have the ketchup bottle on the table that had to be on something. Someone else did. So we had the cloth napkins, someone else had others. Someone else, I don't know, they started eating before everyone sat down, and I mean, they did things differently. Remember the first time you were on a diet, or you married into a family, or they married into yours, and all of a sudden you have new insights about things you'd never given any thought to it before, because that was just how your family operates. But this other family now that's part of your family does it differently, and all of a sudden you have a new perspective. Or you go abroad, and you come back, and you see America like with new eyes, because you're contrasting it to some other place, right? It's not the travel that makes you interesting, it's the ability to contrast what you've experienced somewhere else with what you have always assumed was the way in which things are. So it's only when we have those kinds of experiences that we begin to see the hidden becomes revealed. And the same is true when we appreciate art and someone points out something to us, or a poem, or another modality, right? A language that has a word for exactly that experience that our language lacks for. You're like, wow, that's really amazing, right? And then we get some insight. The teacher in Lydda, Tiberius, or Caesarea, during the classic rabbinic period, could not, had he been so inclined, have specified many of the even obvious premises implied in his exposition of Scripture. He couldn't have explained it. He'd never been anywhere else. He had nothing to contrast it with. And neither could the traditional yeshiva student throughout the ages, despite his erudition and devotion. Because also, they were studying with blinders. There wasn't interfaith dialogue. You know, the Orthodox community up here doesn't engage in Orthodox dialogue. They have rabbinic proscriptions against it. The fear being, or their concern being, that if you were to engage in dialogue with another faith tradition, a couple things would happen. First, a bit of relativism might creep in. You might appreciate something that's on the other side. It might suggest to someone that you have what to learn from another theology or another worldview. And if you want to keep your community essentially hermetically sealed off from these other ideas, well, then don't talk to people who are different than you. If you want your mind opened, well, befriend someone who has a completely different experience than you and listen to her. Right? Okay. They did not have the necessary perspective, these earlier generations. Many centuries would pass before a student could view the literature of the rabbis from a new, post-medieval vantage point, and thus come to appreciate the true meaning and significance of the contributions of the rabbis. Let me say something about that. Following the French Revolution and emancipation in Europe, Jews were allowed then, if they could qualify, like any other school, were to enter universities. And once they were able to enter universities, they were able for the first time, these Jews, to study Judaism disinterestedly. Disinterestedly is different than being uninterested, right? So if you're uninterested, you don't have any interest in at all. If you're disinterested, you're interested, but not from a personal reason. That is to say, I can study women's studies at college in order to better appreciate the experience of women, or African American studies, or French literature, or Islamic religion. Heretofore, what's being described here, after emancipation, after the French Revolution, heretofore, the only people that studied Judaism were of two groups. They were Jews who wanted to be better Jews, more knowledgeable Jews. They wanted to study to be rabbis, or to become a bar mitzvah student, or to master a certain amount of material, because it was germane to them as Jews. The same way members of Calvary may study Anglican tradition or Christianity to become more knowledgeable in your own faith, right? And then there were church fathers who would study Judaism to better understand Judaism, to understand Catholicism or Christianity. But what had not been done, and certainly had not been available to Jews, was to study Judaism, the Bible, history, liturgy, philosophy, as you would study any other literature, or to compare and contrast the way Jewish theology or philosophy evolved alongside or in the same pattern as did other theologies, to begin to suggest, which is what gives rise to the Reform movement, that perhaps, we all heard of the college level course, the Bible is literature, whether you took it or not. We understand that that's a college course, the Bible is literature. But no one prior to this time in history, the 18th century, studied the Bible as literature. The Bible was the revealed Word of God. Hammurabi's code of law, or the stories of Gilgamesh, which we have a sense of as being contemporary or having something to say about it. Noah wasn't the first one to know of a flood, right? We believe we can gain something by reading these other literatures, in the same reason as the idea that a rabbi and a priest are talking about the parables. Well, we have something to contribute and to compare and to contrast, and we believe, those of us who show up for that class, that there's something to be gleaned and gained thereby. But if you don't believe you have what to gain, or you believe that in some ways engaging in dialogue would suggest that your own views are relativistic, are up for question, are mutable, malleable, right? Yes?
Going back to the first and second century CE, how much are the rabbis and the study at that time affected by the fact that they're living in a world dominated by Greek and Roman thought?
Right. So they have a number of cases. There's not an example in the biblical literature, the rabbinic literature, rather not biblical, the rabbinic literature, of taking on Jesus or John the Baptist as the interlocutor. That doesn't. But it's very common for them to describe a philosopher, or what they call an epicurus, which is sort of a heretic, someone who's left the faith, who approaches to challenge the rabbis about certain something. Right? So the classic one is a story about two rabbis named Hillel and Shammai. And they are what's called a zug, which is, say, a pair, often used contrasting with each other. He was lenient and he was harsh, and that idea, sort of a good cop, bad cop kind of idea. And we get insight in those, thank you, we get insights in those interactions about exactly what you're asking about, right? Which is to say, your question again was? Correct.
and of the heritage of the earlier Greek occupation and Greek system of thought, and which comes in with the Romans. I mean, also.
So they take on, there's a classic story of Hillel and Shammai. They're approached by a proselyte who is interested in each of them in turn teaching him the entire Torah while standing on one foot. And so standing on one foot is a Jewish idiom, like in a nutshell. You know what I mean? Distill it down. Tell me everything you need to know while I'm standing on one foot. And Shammai chases him away, the impudence of demanding to know something so serious in such a trivial way. And Hillel explains that everything that's hateful to you, do to no other person. It's a kind of inversion of the golden rule. And this is all the rest is commentary, right? My point in mentioning the story is that this proselyte, Epicurus, heretic, philosopher, they're interchangeable for the rabbis, is set up sort of as a straw man. So they were engaging with the community around them. They have to, but they do it in sort of a deft way of setting up a straw man, sort of a theoretical argument that they can explain against. Right? All kinds of different things. They contrast the way that human beings can mint coins, right? Change coins, money, with the emperor's face on it. Every coin is the same. But God, when God makes creation, every human being is different. Okay, so I only use it as an example. They're engaging with the politics of their day, or the governmental force of the day, or the religious challenges of their day. Right? It goes on further. I mean, later, we jump to the 2nd century. We're in there. That I mentioned to you that every week of the year has a Torah portion assigned to it, so that we read through the entire Torah sequentially. And then their holidays have certain Torah readings that are especially assigned to them, just like you have the certain reading you can anticipate on Christmas or Easter. That reading is assigned to that holiday, and that's what we read. And the decision to read that was made at a certain point by church fathers or religious personages, because the message there was consonant with the holiday, was the message we want to give out when the place is full. I mean, these are political decisions at some level, right? What are we going to teach on Christmas morning? What are we going to teach on Easter morning? You can read anything you want to the public, to the faithful. We're going to choose these selections. So up into about the 2nd, 3rd century, the reading for Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, was the part in the Torah, Exodus or Leviticus, that describes how the holiday is observed. That on the first day of this month, there should be a sacred assembly, you shall blow the ram's horn, and make expiation for your sin. Okay, so that's then the reading. Tells you how to do it. But by the 2nd century, the nascent Christian community, growing out of the Jewish community, is gaining in strength and numbers, and is becoming soon to be the official religions of empires. The Jewish community decides that on Rosh Hashanah they're going to change the Torah reading. And it's no longer going to be about the way in which the holiday is scheduled and observed, but it's instead going to be a story, the first day and the second day. The 2 stories are these. On the first day, the story is going to be about Abraham and Sarah receiving 3 visitors who announce that Sarah, miraculously, because she's 90, will have a child. An announcement by 3 visitors of a miracle birth is going to be the first day. And on the second day, we're going to read the story of Abraham taking his son Isaac, being commanded by God to take his son Isaac up Mount Moriah to sacrifice Isaac. At the end of the story, Abraham's hand is stayed, Isaac is spared, and a ram is substituted for Isaac in the stead. That's Genesis chapter 22. But why was that chosen? Because in the 2nd century, the Christian community, the community within the Jewish community that we're going to know as the Christian community, is growing in force such that a public declaration about a God who announces a miracle birth to a couple that by any rights or lights shouldn't be having children, whether it's a woman who's 90 with her husband 97, or whether it's a virgin. And then in the second story, for the second day, again, the synagogue is full, we have a story about God who initially commands the death of the beloved son, Isaac, but by the story's conclusion, the sacrifice is called off. And God, the Jewish God, doesn't want sacrifice of children, which would have been a big thumb in the eye to the Christian community, who has made central the idea that a miracle birth took place, and not only that, but then God did see through the sacrifice, and not only that, but in the same way as Isaac got up off the sacrificial altar, Jesus, after his death, comes out of the cave. Right? So by deciding that this story in the second century should be the prominent story, which continues all the way in most Jewish congregations today, at Rosh Hashanah, about 15, 16 years ago, we changed the reading of Rosh Hashanah, because the thought of continuing to read a story about a father, forgive me, I'm going to invert the story a little bit, but a father who claims that God demanded that he sacrifice his son. We read terrible stories of parents who have get in their head that this is what they're supposed to do, right? Infanticide is no longer the right reading for us. We're no longer fighting against that. We need a story that's more consonant with the day. And insofar as Rosh Hashanah is theologically also about the creation of the world, we read the story of creation on Rosh Hashanah Day, at Rosh Shalom. Right? So my point in mentioning this is that the decisions as to what to emphasize or what to read or what to make central is necessarily a result of the milieu in which we find ourselves. Right? Yes?
Along with the Isaac story, in the Bible, there's not much said about Isaac after, and his father after that.
Right.
But in like Mishra and all that, is there any stories about?
A lot. So let's think of that story. We could look at the Bible. We could open it up, and if you look at chapter 21 and 22 of Genesis, we have just the story of Abraham and Isaac heading off with the servants and donkeys to the mountain on which Abraham knows he's intending to sacrifice his son. And on the way there, in particular on the description of their walk up the mountain together, Abraham and Isaac share conversation. It's terse, but it's in the biblical record. Isaac asks Abraham a question, he responds to his son, they're making their way up the mountain, then they have the would-be sacrifice, and following that, there's no record of a conversation between Abraham and Isaac ever again. That gives rise to the opportunity for Midrashim, for Midrash to be written about why it was that father and son never spoke again. Right? What was going on therein.
And there is a lot of...
There is. Or even if you look, let me grab a Bible. If you grab, go to Genesis 21. It's really beautiful. Watch this. Okay, Genesis 22. Someone there, I'll read it for you. Okay, I'm going to read you a little bit, chapter 22. The time came when God put Abraham to the test. Abraham he called, and Abraham replied, "Here I am." The Hebrew is Hineni. Here I am. God said, "Take your son Isaac, your only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There you shall offer him as a sacrifice on one of the hills, which I will show you." All right? That's just the opening challenge. Here's the Midrash. The rabbis ask, why does it say, "Take your son, Isaac, your only son whom you love"? Why does it reference this boy in 4 different ways? Take your son, Isaac, your only son, the one whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. So here's their answer. They say, the rabbis do, in the Midrashic tradition, we're only hearing half of this conversation. God says to Abraham, Abraham responds, "Here I am." God says, "Take your son." He says, "I have 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac." Right? He says, "The one whom you love, your only son." And he says, I have 2 sons. He means the only son of Sarah, comes back to the answer. Right? The one whom you love. I love them both. I mean, the idea is that in this, Abraham is trying to get out of it. Or Abraham is trying to pin God down, what's really being asked of me. They're reading into the text an imagined conversation so that Abraham, while being faithful to God, isn't so quiescent that he just goes along. He's just a doormat and he'll do anything. But a father who loves his son wouldn't, even if you have faith in God, the rabbis are trying to grapple with that, right? So anything is ripe for reading that in, and that midrash, that argument with God, is considered part of that oral tradition. I think I mentioned last time that at the end of this story, the Torah portion ends. The Torah portion divisions are rather arbitrary in an effort to essentially give a weekly portion some uniformity, right? But the fact that it ends and the next chapter begins and Sarah dies, another midrash is, well, why did she die so suddenly, or seemingly so suddenly, or why just after this story? Well, something must have happened, and there are all kinds of legends about how it is that Sarah came to know what Abraham was doing while with Isaac away. And so all of that gives rise to midrash and to interpretation. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Okay. Okay. When we today, I'm on the top page 29 on this handout. When we today, with the aid of the techniques of literary criticism is the biblical critical way of reading by saying this text seems to be a compilation of a number of different texts. There's a fragment from here, and there's a fragment from there, and that's why God sometimes is referred to as Adonai, sometimes as Elohim, or that's why it's called Mount Sinai, and that's why it's called Horeb, or that's why in this place it's called Jacob, in another place it's called Israel, that these were different fragments of text that got woven together. Goes the biblical critical approach. It's not the religious approach, that's an academic approach. But we live in that world now. When we today, with the aid of techniques of literary criticism, a knowledge of history, we might know, for instance, I don't know if I'm right about this, that when it describes that Abraham took the knife and held it above Isaac's throat, we might know, for instance, because of our knowledge of history, that the Iron Age actually came 100, 200, 300 years later. And so he couldn't have had a knife. And not the way we understand a knife. You follow me? There may be other things that we can glean about the geography or the history that points out that this is not historically accurate or this was written later. Again, those are modern techniques of bringing that kind of insight to the biblical text, which only happens when you can study this disinterestedly or at a distance. Right? An awareness of the dynamics of human behavior. We know about Freud today. We can't not know it. And so father and son dynamics take on a different gloss. Or husband and wife dynamics. We have different insights that turns out you grew up in a home and you bring all of that experience with you into this marriage. You didn't appreciate that, but it's important to understand, and that's why you're having conflict. Oh, okay, so we can read that into the biblical story too, because it's also describing families, right? Okay. When we today read a rabbinic text, we discern considerably more than the obvious literal meaning of the Hebrew or Aramaic words. As we approach a midrashic passage, we hear the rabbi of the 1st or 2nd or 5th century, regardless of the specific content of the discourse, open his lecture in part as follows. So this is what he's imagining the rabbis bring to the midrashic enterprise. The Bible, as we all know, is divinely revealed, Holy Writ. It is the source of all truth and all wisdom. If we know how to expound the Torah, if our deeds and motives are pure enough, and if we search deeply enough, the Bible provides a sure guide for all time and every circumstance. Know, dear people, that nothing in Scripture is fortuitous or superfluous, neither a jot nor a tittle. Right? Every letter, every jot is there by design, carefully arranged by divine intelligence to teach a significant lesson, which is why, I'm going to stop there, which is why they can talk about why the Torah begins with the second letter of the alphabet. Remember that? This text is Bereshit, Elohim. Why does it start with a B? There's an Aleph, there's an A that could have started with it. If everything is of consequence, then everything can be plumbed for meaning. Right? There are numerous faces to the Torah. Each word is a 70-faceted gem. The numerical value of ayin. Ayin is the letter. Which sparkles a new and ever more brilliant ray as we turn it. I was at a baseball game when I was a kid with my dad, and he pointed out to me that my dad is a retired physician. He pointed out to me that if you watch closely, you'll notice, or you should just appreciate, that when a batter hits the ball, and the ball takes off from home plate, goes in an arc, and then lands in the outfield or in the upper deck or whatever it is, the parabolic path that that ball takes from the time it leaves the bat is such that if you were to graph it, it would be a perfect parabola, like a rainbow. And the amount of time it takes from leaving the bat to reach the apex of the parabola, and the amount of time it takes to then move from the apex down to the glove of the catcher, assuming it's the same height as the bat, is exactly the same amount of time. Understand? If it takes 2.5 seconds to hit from the bat to the glove, at a 1.25 second, it's halfway. And then it goes the other halfway. And what makes these outfielders, my father explained to me, such amazing athletes, over and above their physical abilities, is that their mind, from the moment the ball is hit, they know where to put their glove. That's what's going on. And they run backwards, 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 and they somehow know where to put that glove. And that's an amazing thing. And they're watching, their brain is able to figure out that parabolic arc such that they know how fast to run backwards with their hand at a certain height. And my dad explained this to me. And I said, wow, doesn't that confuse things? He goes, oh, no. That makes the game all the more beautiful when you start to understand these patterns that are going on, or you understand the snowflake is beautiful, but when you actually look at the fractals, or you begin to appreciate the depth, right? There's more there than meets the eye. And the more you understand, the more beautiful it becomes. Right? I think of going to a symphonic concert. It's beautiful. But if you know something about the composer, or you know something about music, or you can hear things that I'm not able to hear because I wasn't trained in that way, well, it's all the more, right? So that's what the rabbis are engaging in here. Every jot, every letter, 70 faces, which sparkles a new and ever more brilliant ray as we turn it and turn it again. That's a phrase from a rabbi named Ben Bagbag. It's a strange name. Rabbi Ben Bagbag famously said that everything is contained in the Torah. You need only turn it and turn it again. Okay. It's sort of a nice image, right? The many levels of meaning within the Torah text are communicated by ways of hints, allusions, mnemonics, by means of intricate cipher codes, giving every letter a number, through metaphor and allegory. That's new insight that the rabbis are bringing to this text. Remember, I think I gave you the image once that for the rabbis, in a metaphor, the Torah was a love letter, as it were, between God and the Jewish people. And if all you had was that letter, well, you'd pore over it and read it, or you wonder what they meant by it, or why they chose that word versus that word, or they misspelled this word. What does it mean? Well, maybe it's a secret code. I just watched a clip. Where did I see it? I don't know. It came through one of my social media feeds. Of an American prisoner of war in Vietnam who, when he was being interrogated, was blinking out the word torture with his eyelids. You ever see this or know about it? Okay. So, obviously, it got past the Vietnamese censors, and you can imagine they didn't pick up on it the first time, but the guys in Langley who were studying this video were poring over every frame of that film until someone figured out, whoa, this looks like Morse code. Let's slow it down. Let's, and all of a sudden it reveals new meaning. Right? That happens. There was also a case just recently, I forget where it was, someone will remember maybe, a very famous museum that realized that for 70 years they've been hanging a picture upside down. Did you see this? It was a modern picture. For 70 years they've been hanging upside down. At this point, now the question is, do you write it? I mean, maybe this is how the picture is. Whistler's mother is not supposed to be upside down. Okay. The Torah addresses each, forgive me the sexism, the Torah addresses each man in accordance with his effort and capacity. You'll understand this much and I'll understand that much. It operates at different levels. But no mortal, bound by finitude, can ever fathom the full depth of the Torah or even claim final authority for his interpretation of any one detail. The lesson there is that the goal was not, with Midrash, to make the definitive explanation so that I can explain to you precisely And I actually use this idea when talking with people who have questions about religion, about faith. I caution them. I say it's really important to be careful not to trade a really good question for an overly facile answer. The question sometimes is much better than any answer, and you should hold fast to the question, because that's going to lead you further than believing that any given answer ends the conversation. There may be questions that have a certain answer, but in things about religion or things about literature, don't be so quick to trade a really good question for an overly facile answer. A greater teacher may supersede you. Someone may come along next generation who knows more than you or builds on what you contributed. The profundity of Scripture is never exhausted. Whatever a dedicated, inspired student derives from a biblical verse is present in the text. Indeed, every conceivable insight was anticipated at Sinai, the ever-present Sinai, the sum of human possibility. Now, that's fascinating. The idea that Sinai, this event that ostensibly took place as described in the book of Exodus, is an ever-ongoing thing. That is to say, that revelation continues. The insights that we glean today are as much and as authentically as part of the Torah as is the insight that was from 1,000 years ago. Now, it may be more authoritative because it came from 1,000 years ago, and the other one we came up with 10 minutes ago, but it's no less official, or no less, that's the right word I want. Authoritative. We tend to give authority to things that came earlier, but it's no less credible. Maybe that's the word I want. Enlightening. Right. It's just as good in terms of what it means today. So if you were to preach this coming weekend, you've got some new insight, on, I'll give you an example. Sort of mixing a metaphor. This past Sunday, were any of you in the parables class with us? Okay, a few were. So the parable was about the laborers in the vineyard and receiving the usual daily wage in this parable, right? Where essentially, for those who don't know it, the owner of a vineyard goes out early in the morning to hire laborers and promises to give them their usual daily wage. And so on that basis, they come and start working at 6 in the morning. He goes back out at 9 in the morning and collects more wages, more laborers, and promises to give them what's fair, what's just. And they come work. And he goes out again at noon and 3 and 5, and throughout the day hires more people, each of whom he's pledged either the usual daily wage or what's just. At the end of the day, when people are being paid, the ones most recently hired are paid first, and they're paid the daily stipend. And the next people, also the daily stipend. And by the time it gets to the people that were hired first, who worked the longest, and they learn that they're going to receive the same thing as the people who only work an hour, they're very upset, right? And they begrudge the fact that they're only making this much when other people made the same amount, even though they worked longer, and there's a discussion. And I volunteered that my insight with beginner's eyes, right, was that what if we understood this usual daily wage to not be something, this comes out of rabbinic hermeneutic, the rabbinic hermeneutic, which is, say, a means of reading the text, is the rabbis introduced the idea that there's no chronology to the text when interpreting it. The Hebrew phrase they use is ein mukdam ve'ein muchar. There's no early and there's no late. And so when we read a text, whether it's Genesis or a parable, if we bring that hermeneutic, we shouldn't trust that the chronology in which we read things or things are described actually happened in that order. And they do this in order to say something that happened generations later happened precisely in order that, right, they can start playing faster and looser with what these texts have to say to one another. I said, if that's true, what if we imagine that the usual daily wage, which I want you to imagine as your daily bread, the daily wage is your daily bread. Imagine that it's not paid at the end of your labor, but is paid as you enter the labor force. Imagine that everyone is given their daily wage or their daily bread or the gift of grace or the gift of life from the landowner on their way in. And the fallacy is complaining by comparing how long other people got to work. You got a longer life than I did or than this person. It's unfair. We say that all the time. They were so young. trouble. What's that?
But you all got your bread.
But you all got your bread, right? I mean, we know better than, at least sermonically, than to compare length of life. That's not the basis. We're talking about something that's infinitely precious. And so what if? Well, that's sort of I'm able to do that because I have the rabbinic license to engage in this midrashic activity. It may be a completely novel and new way of reading the parables, but the suggestion is that insight is as much part of the parable, goes the rabbinic idea, as is the more traditional view, that it's about something messianic, or it's about God's inscrutability, or it's about labor and management relations, or anything else that over the centuries come to be suggested that it's read into or read out of the parable. Right? Okay, questions about that? All right. The profundity of Scripture is never exhausted. Whenever a dedicated, inspired student derives from a biblical verse is present in the text. Indeed, every conceivable insight was anticipated at Sinai. The same Holy Spirit which permeates the Torah is potentially present in us. And if we are worthy, it will aid us in uncovering the truth embedded in the words of Scripture, or we might say, embedded in the truth of your lived experience. You gain a new understanding. There was just a story, an article in the Times this morning about whether it's really possible to love our children unconditionally. Okay, so the article describes the nature of parents and children and whether we actually expect things from our children, whether it's unconditional. All right, so as I'm reading the article, I can't help but think about my own parents and my own parenting, and maybe I get a new insight or a new understanding, and that's sort of how it works, right? Or I gain a new appreciation for something about my family of origin, and it gives me a new insight. So too is what Midrash is intended to do by way of both elucidating the Torah and evoking. Someone said, I one time said to someone, I don't mean to be provocative. They said, well, I don't think you're being provocative. I think you're being evocative. I said, oh, I like that very much. And that's what Midrash is meant to do. It's meant to evoke. Okay. Susan.
I don't understand when people actually hear the part that the rabbis put in. I mean, it's not.
Oh, when would they hear it?
Yeah, I mean, when are people exposed to that?
So in some ways, this material is homiletical. So you'd hear it in sermonic material. You'd hear it if you were studying the text. So there's a story about Abraham is told to leave his father's home and to go to the land that I will show you, and essentially to accept the one God, right? And the rabbis ask, what precipitated Abraham heeding that call? And they imagine that his father, who was described as prosperous, right? He had lots of heads of cattle or whatever, that he was a successful businessman. And he was engaged in the sale of idols. He had an idol shop where you could go and buy a new icon to worship in your home. But that one day, Abraham's father left him alone in the shop. He has this insight that these idols are just carved pieces of wood and stone, and they're not worth venerating. They don't have any actual powers. And he destroys all the idols in his father's shop. But before he's done, he places the club with which he destroyed these idols in the hands of the largest idol. When his father returns, he's aghast to see what's happened to the family business. And Abraham explains that the largest idol beat up all the other idols. And his father says, that's crazy. You know these idols can't do anything. And Abraham goes, aha, quite so. We should not be worshiping idols. We should follow the one true God. And that's a midrash. Right? It's lovely. It's lovely in the way George Washington and the cherry tree. It's lovely. We understand what it's meant to do. I wonder, I hazard to even, how many high school seniors in America believe that George Washington cut down a cherry tree? As surely as they're certain that he's on the penny or the $1 bill. I don't know. There's certainly a lot of Jews out in the pews, as it were, right, who might not know that the story of Abraham and the idols is midrashic and not biblical. They might mistake it because it's so familiar, at least sort of out there. They're not terribly biblically literate, most folks, and the story sounds like it's authoritative, and where else would it come from if they don't know that there's a Midrashic tradition? You could get blurred. It happens for us too, just in terms of our own biblical illiteracy. We've spoken of it, maybe you know, but there are two stories of creation in Genesis, two very different creation narratives. We tend to conflate them, right? They're just so, to whet your curiosity if you aren't aware, the Genesis 1, chapter 1, is the six-day creation story with God resting on the seventh. Chapter 2 is about Adam and Eve. The stories don't line up in terms of the order of creation and what's happening, what the import of the first story is about God resting. The second story is about human beings being on the top of the animal kingdom and being responsible for the animals in the garden and the earth and caretaking, and two very different stories. We tend to conflate them. We, the vast majority of people out there, because the idea that two stories is incongruous. So we square that, right, by doing that. So when would you hear these stories? When would you ever learn that? You might learn it in a class. You might learn it in a homily or a sermon or in studying these texts. But if you only read the Bible, if you only read the Torah, you would never hear those Midrashic stories, which is not perhaps why, but it is the case that for Jews it's very hard to read the Bible or discuss it absent the Midrash, absent the insights of centuries that give us some understanding as to not why it took place, but how our community has understood why it took place. Does that make sense? Such that we celebrate the days in the beginning of the evening. It's not a matter of whether it's right or wrong. It's how the interpretation came to be so that we could function, or we can share common understandings about how our polity works or how our community works. Okay. How are we doing? I think we're at 2, yeah? All right. So next week will be our last session. We'll wrap it all up. All right? I appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Delighted. I'm happy to take them back. If you don't want to hold on to them, I will make sure they get recycled to other classes.
Well, thank you. As always.
Delighted. Thank you all.